The Mafia boss who owned the city didn't know he was being played. What he did next shook the underworld. The safe house exploded behind Marco as he crashed through the back door, flames licking at his heels. Vincent, his most trusted lieutenant for 15 years, lay dying on the concrete, blood pooling around his chest. Marco dropped beside him, pressing his jacket against the wound, but Vincent's eyes were already glazing over. "Boss," Vincent whispered, grabbing Marco's collar with weakening fingers. They knew. They knew before we even moved. Who knew? Who did this? Vincent's grip loosened. Every exit, they knew. Then he was gone. Marco forced himself up, scanning the alley. 3 escape routes he'd planned. 3 getaway cars positioned across the district. But as he ran toward the first location, he found it empty. The car was gone. At the second spot, police barriers blocked the street. The third route led to a dead end that hadn't existed yesterday. Someone had predicted every move. Not followed. Predicted. Marco pressed against a cold brick wall, hard hammering, and felt something shift in his mind, a terrible realization creeping in like ice water. Whoever was hunting him wasn't reading his plans. They were reading his thoughts before he even had them. Marco had ruled the city for 23 years. 23 years without a single serious challenge to his throne. Every union from the docks to the construction sites paid tribute. Every port shipment passed through his channels. Judges called him before making decisions that might affect his interests. The Irish, the Russians, the Colombians, they all knew their boundaries and respected them. He was Don Marco de Luca, and the city breathed because he allowed it. But that power had made him comfortable. Lazy, even. He'd stopped questioning things that ran smoothly. Stopped checking the details that didn't seem to matter. When you own everything, you stop looking at the foundation beneath your feet. Now, hiding in a rented room across town, Marco forced himself to think back. What had he missed? What business had slipped through his careful audits? Then it hit him, one enterprise he'd launched 12 years ago and never really examined again. It ran perfectly, made clean money, required no supervision. He'd been so pleased with it that he'd left it alone. The cafes. His chain of 24-hour cafes spread across every neighborhood. 12 years ago, Marco had needed a better way to launder money. Restaurants were obvious, too scrutinized. But cafes, simple, high-volume, cash-heavy cafes, those were perfect. He'd opened 15 locations in the first year, serving coffee and pastries around the clock. The genius was making them neutral territory. Marco had spread the word through the underworld, no violence in the cafes, no deals going bad, no scores settled. They were safe zones where anyone could meet without fear. Even cops grabbed coffee there, which gave the operation cover. Within 3 years, the cafes became institutions. Bosses held peace talks at corner tables. Soldiers celebrated promotions over espresso. Families gathered after christenings. The cafes wove themselves into the fabric of the city, trusted and unquestioned. Marco had been so proud of that network. Clean money flowing in, perfect meeting spaces for sensitive business, and everyone loved them. But now, crouched in that rented room, he remembered something small. A moment from years ago that he dismissed. He'd been sitting in his flagship location, reviewing accounts, when he'd glanced up and caught one of the waitresses watching him with strange intensity. Not admiration. Not fear. Something calculating. Her name was Naomi, and she'd worked at Marco's cafes for over 8 years. Quiet, professional, always smiling politely but never trying to get close or ask for favors like some employees did. She was a black woman in her early 30s, average height, with observant eyes that seemed to absorb everything. What made her unusual was her memory. She never wrote down orders. Ever. Didn't matter if a customer ordered once or 50 times, she remembered. Not just what they ordered, but how they liked it, what time they preferred, who they usually met with. Marco had noticed her finishing his sentences once or twice, chalking it up to good service. She'd bring his regular order before he asked. She'd position the newspaper exactly where he'd want it. Small things that seemed like excellent anticipation. But then came the incident that should have alarmed him. Marco had been sitting at his usual table, about to discuss territory adjustments with Carlo, when Naomi appeared beside him with his coffee. She set it down gently and said, quietly, "You shouldn't sit at that table today, Mr. DeLuca." He'd looked at her, surprised. Why not? She'd simply smiled and walked away. Marco had ignored her warning. Pride wouldn't let him change tables because a waitress said so. But that entire meeting, he'd felt uneasy, exposed. Nothing happened, but the feeling lingered. 2 weeks after Naomi's warning, Anthony Russo, head of the East Side crew, met Marco at one of his cafes. They'd talked about a shipment conflict, and Marco had shared information about a rival trying to undercut them both. Private information that only Anthony and Marco knew. 6 hours later, that rival was dead in his apartment. Shot twice in the head, professional job. The police investigated. They traced it back to Anthony's crew, found the shooter, built a case. But here's what haunted Marco: the shooter knew details about the target that Anthony hadn't shared with anyone. Details Marco had mentioned to Anthony in their cafe conversation. Details that should have been impossible for anyone else to know. No phones had been on the table. They'd both checked for wires, for anyone listening. The cafe had been moderately busy, normal crowd, normal noise. Nothing suspicious. Yet somehow, precise information from their private conversation had leaked within hours. Marco had assumed Anthony had betrayed the confidence. But Anthony swore he hadn't told anyone. And Marco believed him. He'd looked genuinely confused about how the information had spread. That incident happened in Marco's cafe. In his supposedly safe neutral ground. After Vincent's death, Marco started investigating his own businesses. He visited cafes late at night, examining them like crime scenes. That's when he found the markings. Underneath tables, scratched into the wood where customers wouldn't notice unless they looked, strange symbols. Circles intersected by lines, geometric patterns that seemed familiar somehow. Marco found them at 5 different locations, always beneath tables where important meetings happened. His blood went cold when he recognized them. He'd seen these symbols once before, decades ago, when his father had shown him old Sicilian photographs. They were initiation sigils, marks used by ancient Mafia families during blood rituals. His father had explained they were obsolete, forgotten, relics from a superstitious past. But here they were, carved into Marco's cafe tables. Fresh enough that the wood was still light-colored around the edges. He took photographs, planning to investigate further. But when he returned the next night, they were gone. Someone had sanded the tables smooth, removing all evidence. The wood had been refinished so perfectly you'd never know anything had been there. Someone was watching Marco investigate. Someone knew exactly when he discovered the symbols and had erased them before he could show anyone else. Marco called an emergency meeting with his 5 captains. They gathered at his estate, and he explained everything: the impossible leaks, the symbols, the feeling of being predicted rather than followed. They laughed. Not openly, not disrespectfully, but Marco saw it in their eyes. They thought he was becoming paranoid, jumping at shadows like old bosses do when their power starts slipping. "Boss, maybe you're working too hard," Carlo said carefully. "Vincent's death hit us all hard. Sometimes stress makes us see patterns that aren't there." The symbols were real, Marco insisted. "Maybe kids scratching tables," Angelo suggested. "Happens all the time." Only Paolo stayed quiet, watching Marco with serious eyes. After the meeting, he approached Marco privately. "Boss, I believe you. Something's been feeling wrong for months. I can't explain it, but I've felt watched in those cafes." Finally, someone who understood. "Keep visiting them," Marco told him. "Watch for anything unusual." Paolo nodded and left. 3 days later, Paolo vanished. His apartment was empty, his car abandoned at the marina. No signs of struggle, no ransom demand, no body. He simply ceased to exist. And Marco knew Paolo had stopped visiting the cafes after their conversation, and they'd noticed. The dreams started that week. Every night, the same nightmare: Marco would be sitting in his flagship cafe, alone in the darkness. The tables around him were filled with shadowy figures he couldn't quite see. They were voting on something, hands rising and falling, but he couldn't hear their words. Just the scrape of chairs, the clink of cups. Then one shadow would turn toward him, and he'd feel absolute terror, the certainty that they'd decided on his death. He'd wake up gasping, sweat-soaked, his bedroom dark and silent. Until the fourth night, when he woke up and went downstairs for water, and found his dining room arranged exactly like the cafe in his dream. Same table configuration. Same lighting. Even the same number of chairs. Marco hadn't arranged it that way. His staff swore they hadn't touched anything. He stood there, trembling in his own house, until he heard a voice behind him. "The dreams won't stop, Mr. DeLuca." Marco spun around. Naomi stood in his doorway, wearing her cafe uniform, looking at him with something like pity. "How did you get in my house?" "You invited me," she said calmly. "In your mind. You've been calling out for weeks." Marco should have called security. Should have had her removed, questioned, eliminated. But something in her voice stopped him. She wasn't threatening. She was warning. "You dreamed of the cafe," she said. "The vote. The shadows deciding your fate. How do you know that?" "Because they practice on men like you. They've been doing it for generations. They refine their methods, perfect their control, and then they move on to the next city, the next power structure." Marco grabbed a chair to steady himself. Who are they?" Naomi moved closer, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "The ones who make bosses think they chose their own power. The ones who let you believe you built an empire when really, you were building a cage. That's impossible. I fought for everything I have. I earned. Did you?" She tilted her head. "Or did obstacles remove themselves too easily? Did enemies fall at convenient times? Did opportunities appear exactly when needed?" Marco's mind raced back through years of memories, and suddenly he couldn't be certain. Had his rise been too smooth? Too perfect? "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because I'm tired," she said simply. "And because you might be different. But I can't explain more. Not here. Not where they're listening." "Where then?" "Meet me alone. Tomorrow night. The closed cafe on Barlow Street." She turned to leave, then paused. "And Mr. DeLuca. Don't tell anyone. They'll die before they can help you." Marco didn't wait for tomorrow. The next morning, he ordered all 15 cafes shut down immediately. He sent crews to each location with instructions to empty them, lock them, and prepare them for demolition. If the cafes were the source of this surveillance, this manipulation, he'd eliminate them completely. His captains protested. The cafes were profitable, beloved by the community, useful for their operations. But Marco was adamant. Burn them all if necessary. They closed every location within 6 hours. That night, 2 of Marco's soldiers died in their homes. Heart attacks, the doctor said. Both men were 35 and healthy. The next morning, a captain's son was found dead in his college dorm. Another heart attack. Then Marco's accountant. Then his lawyer. Then a judge on his payroll. All heart attacks. All within 48 hours of closing the cafes. The killings weren't stopping. They were accelerating. Marco had made a terrible mistake. The cafes weren't the source of the surveillance. They were a comfort, a distraction, maybe even a protective barrier. Now that he'd removed them, whatever had been watching him through them was striking directly. The cafes had never been his prison. They'd been his leash. And he'd just dropped it. Carlo, Angelo, and Dominic died next, all 3 within the same hour, all from sudden cardiac arrest while having conversations with associates. They were discussing how to protect themselves, sharing what they knew about the recent deaths. The police found no evidence of poison, no signs of violence. Just 3 healthy men whose hearts had simply stopped beating mid-sentence. When Marco examined Carlo's body at the funeral home, he noticed something under his collar, a tiny mark, barely visible. He checked the others. Same mark. A precise puncture wound behind the left ear. Marco went back to Carlo's office and searched it himself. Behind his bookshelf, he found a small listening device. But it wasn't electronic. It was made of carved bone, hollow, with strange symbols etched along its length. The same symbols he'd seen under the cafe tables. Someone had been listening to his people using ancient methods that modern detection couldn't find. And when they heard too much, They'd been eliminated with something that left no trace. Marco realized then how deep this went. This wasn't about technology or modern surveillance. This was old. Ritualistic. Beyond anything he understood. Marco went to Barlow Street that night, to the closed cafe. Naomi was waiting at the locked door. She led him inside without speaking, through the empty dining room to the kitchen, then to a door Marco had never noticed before. It led down, steep stairs descending into darkness. The underground room was massive, stretching beneath multiple buildings. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, and the center held a long table covered in leather-bound books. "What is this?" Marco whispered. "The archive," Naomi said, turning on a dim light. "Records of every major family in every major city for the past 200 years. Decisions, weaknesses, bloodlines, initiation rituals. Everything." She pulled out a drawer and removed a folder. Marco's name was on it. She opened it, and he saw photographs of himself from childhood, documents about his family, detailed notes about his personality, his ambitions, his fears. But the folder started in 1981, 4 years before Marco was born. "How?" he breathed. Naomi flipped to the first page. There, in careful handwriting, Marco De Luca, approved candidate. Father has accepted terms. Contract initiated August 1981. They'd chosen him before he existed. Everything he thought he'd built had been arranged before he'd taken his first breath. "They call themselves the Syndicate," Naomi explained, her voice echoing in the underground chamber. "Not a government, not a criminal organization, something older. They don't rule with violence or fear. They rule with conditioning, with belief, with the illusion of choice." She showed Marco more files. Dozens of names he recognized. Famous bosses, legendary criminals, men who'd shaped the underworld for decades. All of them had folders that predated their births. "Mafia bosses aren't born from ambition," she continued. "They're selected. Families are evaluated for generations. Children are identified early, marked as candidates. Then circumstances are arranged, opportunities provided, obstacles removed, victories ensured, all to make the candidate believe they earned their power through strength and cunning." "Why?" Marco asked. "What's the point?" "Control. If they simply appointed leaders, those leaders would rebel, would question orders. But if leaders believe they achieved power through their own merit, they never question the foundation beneath them. They protect the very system that enslaved them." Marco thought of his father, how he'd always encouraged his ambitions, how he provided seed money for his first operations, how he'd connected him with the right people at the right times. He thought his father was supporting his son. "My father sold me," Marco said quietly. Naomi nodded. "In August 1981. You were the price of his survival. The contract required him to prepare you, shape you, and deliver you to your role. In exchange, his debts were forgiven and his enemies disappeared. The contract isn't finished," she added. "It ends when you do." Naomi showed Marco the actual contract, a piece of parchment that looked ancient but was dated 30 years ago. His father's signature at the bottom, along with symbols he couldn't read. The terms were clear: Marco's father would receive protection, prosperity, and power in exchange for raising a son who would serve the syndicate's interests. The son would be guided into leadership, supported until he achieved dominance, and then maintained in that position as long as he served their purposes. "What happens when I stop serving their purposes?" Marco asked. "They retire you. Usually through spectacular downfall, arrests, betrayals, or assassinations that look natural. Then they select the next candidate." Marco thought back to his father's death 8 years ago. Cancer, the doctors had said. Sudden and aggressive. He'd been healthy 1 month, dead the next. "The contract transfers upon the father's death," Naomi said, reading his thoughts. "You became fully theirs when he died. No intermediary, no buffer. Just you and them. Why are they coming for me now? Because you started asking questions. The moment you began investigating the cafes, examining the foundation of your power, you violated the core rule: never look behind the curtain. Once you look, once you see the strings, you become dangerous. You have to be replaced." Marco felt rage building in his chest. "I'll fight them. I'll expose them. They're already moving, Naomi interrupted. Look. She showed him her phone. News alerts were flooding in, Marco's accountants had been arrested for fraud, judges were reversing previous favorable rulings, political allies were calling for investigations. His empire was being dismantled in real time. They're marking you for retirement, Mr. DeLuca. And when they mark someone, that someone disappears. Over the next 3 days, Marco watched his world collapse. Assets were frozen. Properties were seized. Associates turned themselves into prosecutors, offering testimony against him in exchange for immunity. Soldiers abandoned their posts. Even his personal guards quietly resigned. The pressure was immense and came from every direction simultaneously. It wasn't one or two betrayals, it was systematic destruction, orchestrated with precision that seemed impossible. And through it all, Marco couldn't reach Naomi. She'd vanished after showing him the archive. Her apartment was empty. Other cafe employees claimed they'd never heard of anyone named Naomi. When he checked payroll records, her name wasn't there. It was as if she'd never existed. Marco was alone, watching everything he'd built dissolve like it had never been real. Then, on the 4th day, she appeared at his doorstep. Bruised, exhausted, but alive. They had me, she said, pushing past him into the house. 3 days of interrogation. They wanted to know what I'd told you, how much you understood. What did you tell them? Everything, she said, meeting his eyes. I told them you were broken, that you understood your place, that you'd submit if they gave you a chance. Will they? No, she said. But I bought us time. Enough time for one final move. She pulled papers from her jacket. There's a ritual. An ancient one that the syndicate uses to bind cities to their will. If we can perform it in reverse, in public, we can break their hold completely. Expose them. Free everyone. Marco looked at the pages covered in symbols and instructions. What's the cost? Your reputation. Everything you've built publicly. You'll have to confess crimes, betray allies, tear down your own legend. You'll go from feared boss to despised criminal. But you'll be free. And what's your cost? Marco asked, studying her battered face. She looked away. Don't worry about me. Naomi's plan was insane. Marco was supposed to go public with his crimes, murders, extortion, corruption, everything. Contact newspapers, television stations, prosecutors. Hold nothing back. Destroy his own reputation so thoroughly that he became worthless as a symbol of power. The syndicate needs you to be a king, she explained. If you become a rat, a snitch, a broken man begging for mercy, you're no longer useful to their narrative. They maintain control through powerful figures who believe in their own strength. Take away that belief, that image, and their entire system weakens. But I'll go to prison. I'll lose everything. You've already lost everything, she said gently. The only question is whether you lose it on your terms or theirs. She was right. The arrests were coming anyway. The betrayals were already happening. At least this way, Marco controlled the narrative. They spent 2 days preparing. Marco recorded confessions, compiled evidence, contacted journalists. Naomi helped him organize it all, ensuring maximum impact. When do we release it? Marco asked. Tomorrow morning. Simultaneous release to every major outlet. It'll break before they can stop it. That night, Marco barely slept. He thought about his father, about the contract he'd signed before Marco was born. About the life he'd lived thinking he was powerful, only to discover he was a puppet. About Vincent, Paolo, Carlo, and all the others who died for asking questions. He thought about freedom, and what it might cost, and whether it was worth burning everything to achieve it. At dawn, he pressed send. The story exploded across every news channel within hours. Don Marco DeLuca, feared crime boss, untouchable power broker, had turned himself in and was confessing to decades of crimes in exchange for witness protection. He named names, provided evidence, detailed operations that police had never been able to crack. Marco looked weak. Pathetic. A once powerful man broken by fear and exposure, scrambling to save himself through cooperation. The city erupted. Rival gangs saw opportunity and moved into territories Marco had controlled for years. Violence spiked as old boundaries dissolved. His former soldiers fought each other for scraps of the empire. The police made hundreds of arrests based on his testimony. It was chaos. Absolute chaos. And through it all, Naomi stayed beside Marco in his protective custody cell, watching the news coverage with satisfaction. "Look," she said, pointing to the screen. "No mysterious deaths. No heart attacks. No impossible coincidences." She was right. The systematic elimination had stopped completely. People Marco had testified against were arrested normally, held in normal jails, processed through normal courts. No one was dying mysteriously. "They've stopped interfering," Marco said. "For now," Naomi corrected. "They're watching. Waiting to see what you do next." "What do you mean?" She looked at him with those observant eyes. "This isn't over, Mr. DeLuca. The hard part is about to begin." 2 weeks passed in silence. No attempts on Marco's life. No pressure from the syndicate. No mysterious deaths among those connected to him. It was as if they'd simply stopped. Marco was transferred to a secure federal facility, awaiting trial and sentencing. His lawyer said he'd likely get 15 years with the cooperation deal, possibly less. People he'd named were being prosecuted. The city's underworld was restructuring without him. Everything seemed normal. Legal. Above board. But Naomi's warning echoed in Marco's mind, "They only stop when the test begins." What test? He'd asked her during that conversation. The test to see if you're worth keeping alive. If you're truly broken, truly useless to them, they'll let you rot in prison. But if you show any sign of being able to disrupt them further, they'll activate their failsafe. What failsafe? She'd gone quiet then, and Marco hadn't pressed her. But now, sitting in his cell watching news coverage of his destroyed empire, he wondered what she'd meant. The answer came on day 18. A guard delivered a message, "You have a visitor. Someone from your old life." Marco was escorted to a visiting room, expecting a lawyer or former associate. Instead, he found an invitation on the table, an elegant card with an address and a time. "There's a cafe reopening," the guard explained. "The one on Barlow Street. They're calling it a peace summit. Every major boss in the city will be there. They want you to attend as a gesture of reconciliation." "I'm in federal custody." "How would I?" "Temporary release has been authorized. Special circumstances. You'll be escorted, supervised, but you can attend." Marco looked at the invitation again and saw Naomi's handwriting on the back, "Trust me." The cafe on Barlow Street looked exactly as it had before closing, polished, welcoming, warm lighting spilling through the windows. Marco arrived in handcuffs, escorted by federal agents, feeling everyone's eyes on him. Inside, the cafe was packed. Every major boss from the restructured underworld sat at tables, cups of espresso in front of them. The Irish leaders, the Russian crew heads, the independent operators who'd carved up Marco's former territory. Even some of his old captains who'd survived the chaos. They watched Marco with contempt, amusement, curiosity. The fallen king being paraded before the new court. Naomi stood at the counter in her uniform, smiling politely. She nodded to an empty table in the center, the same table from Marco's dreams. He sat down. The federal agents positioned themselves at the door. "Gentlemen," Naomi announced, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "Thank you all for coming. This is more than a reopening. This is an education." She walked to the wall and pressed something. Hidden panels slid aside, revealing projection screens. The cafe's windows darkened automatically, sealing them in. "What is this?" one of the Russian bosses demanded. "The truth," Naomi said simply. Then the projections began, decades of documents, photographs, recordings. Evidence of the syndicate's manipulation of every major crime family in the city. Contracts like Marco's father's. Archives showing how bosses had been selected, raised, and controlled. The symbols, the rituals, the methods. Everything Marco had discovered, and more. The cafe erupted in shouting. Bosses were on their feet, demanding explanations, accusations flying. But Naomi kept playing the evidence, methodically showing how each of them had been guided into their positions, how their rivalries had been manufactured, how their wars had served purposes they'd never understood. "You're all puppets," she said coldly. "Every one of you." Marco was just the first to figure it out. Then Marco heard it, a low humming sound, barely audible. The lights flickered. And Naomi moved to the door, locking it from the inside. "The syndicate doesn't like exposure," she said. "So let's see what they do when they can't hide." The projections continued, showing more evidence. Names of syndicate members, their positions in legitimate society, their methods of control. Banking executives, political advisors, cultural leaders, people who seemed to have nothing to do with crime but who'd shaped the underworld for generations. The bosses in the cafe went silent, watching the screens with growing horror. Some faces on the projections were familiar, people they'd thought were allies, partners, friends. "The syndicate doesn't rule through violence," Naomi explained, her voice steady despite the tension. "They rule through belief. They make you believe you're powerful, independent, in control. But every major decision you've made was guided. Every victory was arranged. Every defeat served their purpose." "That's impossible," one of the Irish leaders said. "I built my crew from nothing. No one helped me." His photo appeared on the screen. Documents showing payments to his early enemies, accidents that removed his competition, loans that appeared at crucial moments. His entire rise, mapped out and documented. "You all built empires from nothing," Naomi said. "That's what made it perfect. You never questioned the foundation because you thought you'd laid it yourselves." The humming sound grew louder. The lights flickered more violently. Some bosses moved toward the door, but it wouldn't open. "What's happening?" someone shouted. "The failsafe," Naomi said quietly. "The syndicate's final control measure. When too many puppets see the strings at once, they eliminate everyone in the room. It's happened before in other cities." "You trapped us here to die," a boss yelled. "No," Naomi said, looking at Marco. "I trapped us here to break free." Then she nodded at him. This was it, the moment she'd been preparing for. The test she'd warned about. Marco stood up, feeling the eyes of the room on him. The failed king. The informant. The broken boss. But also the only person in the room who'd already let go of power, who had nothing left to lose. "The failsafe won't work on all of us," Marco said, his voice carrying through the cafe. "Watch." The humming reached a crescendo, and suddenly several bosses clutched their chests. The same cardiac response that had killed Marco's captains, his soldiers. The syndicate's ultimate weapon, activated remotely through methods Marco still didn't fully understand. But he felt nothing. No chest pain, no struggle to breathe. He stood there, calm, while chaos erupted around him. "Why isn't it affecting you?" someone gasped. "Because I already died," Marco said simply. "I destroyed everything they built through me. I'm already nothing to them. The failsafe is designed to kill people who believe they're powerful, who have something to protect. I have nothing. I am nothing." The bosses who'd been affected began to recover as if the attack had passed over them. The humming stopped. The light steadied. Naomi stepped forward. "The failsafe requires belief to work. It's not a weapon, it's a command, a trigger embedded in years of conditioning. But if you reject the belief that you were ever powerful on your own, if you accept that everything was given and can be taken away, the trigger has nothing to activate." She looked around the room. "You're all free now. You know the truth. The syndicate's power came from your ignorance. Now that you know, now that you've seen the evidence, you can choose to walk away. Build something real. Or stay and play their game knowingly." "Why did you do this?" one of the bosses asked her. "Who are you really?" Naomi smiled sadly. "That's the final revelation. And why Marco was the key to all of this." She pulled up one more document on the screen, her own file. Her own archive entry, starting decades ago. "I was raised by the syndicate," she said. "Born into it, trained from childhood to observe power, to understand how control works. I was supposed to be the next generation of their enforcers, groomed to replace someone like Marco when his usefulness ended." She looked at Marco. "I was supposed to study you, learn from your downfall, and take your place in the new structure they'd build. But watching you, seeing you choose truth over power, seeing you burn everything to be free, you changed the equation. You chose me over them, Marco said quietly. I chose freedom over control, she corrected. For all of us. The room remained silent as Naomi explained her role. She'd been embedded in Marco's cafes for years, observing not just him but everyone who passed through. Learning the syndicate's methods from the inside while slowly realizing she didn't want to inherit their system. When Marco started investigating, she said, I had a choice. Report him immediately and let him be eliminated, or help him expose everything and destroy the system from within. I chose exposure. But that means they'll come for you, one of the bosses said. They already have, Naomi replied. The 3 days I disappeared. They were preparing me for retirement. But I told them I'd learned something important, something they needed to know before eliminating me. They gave me this final meeting to prove my loyalty. She gestured to the locked cafe. This was supposed to be my test. Trap all the witnesses, activate the failsafe, eliminate everyone who'd seen too much, and prove I was still theirs. Instead, I'm breaking the control ritual permanently. She walked to the center of the cafe, where symbols had been carved into the floor under a rug. The same symbols Marco had seen everywhere, ancient Sicilian sigils that had been at the foundation of the syndicate's power. These marks channel belief into control, she explained. They're at every important location in this city, hidden but present. They're what made the failsafe possible, what let the syndicate influence hearts and minds. But if I break the primary symbol, here in their oldest location, the entire network collapses. What happens to you if you do that? Marco asked, knowing the answer before she spoke. I was raised in their system. My conditioning runs deeper than yours, deeper than anyone's. When the network collapses, it'll collapse through me. No, Marco said, moving toward her. There has to be another way. There isn't, she said firmly. This is my choice. Freedom or control, remember. I choose freedom. For all of you. Before anyone could stop her, Naomi drove a knife through the center symbol carved in the floor. The effect was immediate. The humming returned, but different, higher-pitched, frantic. The symbols throughout the cafe began to glow faintly, then crack. Documents scattered as if hit by wind, though the room was sealed. Naomi collapsed, convulsing. Marco rushed to her side, but she grabbed his hand with surprising strength. It's working, she whispered. I can feel it breaking. All across the city, the archive, the hidden marks, the conditioned responses. Everything they built over centuries is collapsing. You're dying, Marco said, his voice breaking. I was never really alive, she replied. Not in any way that mattered. I was a tool, just better trained than the others. At least now I'm choosing how my story ends. The other bosses had backed away, watching in awe and horror as the ritual completed. The lights exploded, plunging them into darkness lit only by the cracking symbols in the floor. Promise me, Naomi said, her grip weakening. Promise you'll help them understand. The freedom is real, but it comes with responsibility. No one is guiding them anymore. No one is arranging their victories. Whatever comes next, they have to build it themselves. I promise, Marco said. She smiled. Good. Tell them the city was never owned. Only borrowed. And now the lease is up. Then her hand went limp. The symbols stopped glowing. The humming ceased. The federal agents broke through the door, flooding the cafe with flashlights. But it was over. Naomi was gone, and with her, the syndicate's hold on the city. The weeks that followed were chaos. The evidence Naomi had displayed couldn't be suppressed, too many witnesses, too many phones recording once the doors were opened. The story broke internationally, a secret organization that had manipulated organized crime for generations, finally exposed. Prosecutions followed, but they were complicated. How do you charge people for crimes of conditioning and manipulation? How do you prove control that operated through belief? Most of the syndicate members walked free, their power dissolved not through law but through revelation. The underworld collapsed completely. Without the hidden guidance, without the arranged territories and managed conflicts, it devolved into fragmented chaos. Small crews fighting over scraps. No structure, no hierarchy, no agreed-upon rules. Marco served 8 years, less than expected, and was released into a world that had forgotten him. Don Marco De Luca was a cautionary tale now, a symbol of corruption rather than power. Young criminals didn't invoke his name with respect. They barely remembered it at all. He moved to a small town upstate, living quietly under a new name. But he kept track of the city, watching from a distance as it slowly rebuilt itself. The criminal element didn't disappear, but it changed. Smaller, more scattered, less organized. And importantly, less manipulated. The crimes were genuine now, not orchestrated. The violence was chaotic, not directed. It was worse in some ways, better in others. But it was real. That was what mattered. Then, 6 months ago, something caught Marco's attention. A news story about community centers opening in poor neighborhoods. The article mentioned strange artwork on the walls, geometric symbols that reminded locals of old traditions. He recognized them immediately. The cafe symbols. Someone was drawing them again. Marco returned to the city for the first time in years. The community centers were real, serving disadvantaged kids and families. But in one, the same building where Naomi's flagship cafe had operated, he found them. Fresh chalk drawings on the playground pavement. The same symbols, drawn by children. A teacher approached him. "Can I help you?" "These symbols," Marco said. "Do you know where the kids learned them?" She smiled. "It's the strangest thing. They say a nice lady taught them last summer. Described her as someone who worked here long ago. But that's impossible, this building's been a community center for years." Marco knelt beside the drawings, touching the chalk lines. The symbols were imperfect, childish. But they were there. "What do the kids say the symbols mean?" he asked. "They call them freedom marks," the teacher said. "They say if you draw them, you remember that no one owns you. That power is just pretend, and you can always choose to walk away." Marco stayed there for a long time after she left, watching children play around the symbols, their laughter echoing off buildings that had once trembled at his name. Naomi had said power always creates watchers. She was right. But she'd also created something else, a reminder, passed down through innocence, that the watchers could be watched, that control could be broken, that freedom was always possible if you were willing to pay the price. The city was never owned. It was borrowed. And now a new generation was learning what that meant. Marco walked away from those chalk marks feeling something he hadn't felt in decades, hope. Not for power, not for control, but for the messy, chaotic, genuine freedom that came from knowing the truth. That was Naomi's final gift. Not just liberation from the syndicate, but understanding that true power was in choosing to let go. Marco never returned to the city after that day. But he heard the symbols kept appearing, in parks, on sidewalks, on walls. Little reminders that someone was always watching, but that someone could always choose to stop, to walk away, to be free. And in the end, that choice